case you couldn't tell from the title of the game and the thumbnail, this episode is going to get a bit spicy. At the very least, it's going to have some scenes where someone's going to walk into the room as you're watching them and you're going to be really embarrassed. Plan your viewing accordingly. With that warning out of the way, it's time to talk about Hacker International. As I've been documenting game libraries, I've been sticking to official releases. The reason for that is, once you start including unofficial stuff, well, there's literally no end to it. And in Japan, the unofficial stuff is not especially interesting. Almost every single unlicensed release that was made for the Famicom and the Famicom Disk System during those systems' lifespan and released in Japan was something like strip poker, strip mahjong, strip slot machines, and not even good versions of any of those games. The company behind many of these titles was Hacker International. They actually used multiple names over the years, including Map Japan when they went legit toward the end. But it says Hacker on the box for Body ConQuest, so we're just going to call them Hacker International for this video. The company didn't start out making games. Their original products were kits to modify your Famicom for better video output and add turbo functions to the hardwired controllers. And then Nintendo sued them. Nintendo really hated Hacker International. That case was settled out of court, but Hacker kept having legal issues with Nintendo. When Famicom Magazine covered some of their games in a brief section, giving them all extremely negative reviews, I might add, Nintendo threatened to cut them off from all material for previews and reviews, forcing the board members of the publisher to make a public apology to Nintendo. Hacker International games were only available by mail order, but they still managed to sell tens of thousands of copies of them. However, all this has given Hacker International a bit of cachet in Japan. They're not popular, and nobody really talks about their games because their games aren't very good, but Famicom fans are very familiar with the company that kept releasing weird games with nudie pictures in them. So it's often a bit pricey to collect their stuff. I'm not going to go through all of Hacker International's games. Frankly, you couldn't pay me to play any game that has the word Lolita in the title. But I wanted to take a look at least one of theirs. And so here is Body ConQuest. There's two primary reasons I chose it. First, it's one of their more successful games. Hacker International released several horny RPGs, and Body ConQuest seemed to be the high point of those on the Famicom Disk System. And the other reason is that since it only has about 6 risque pictures in it, I'm not going to be spending all of my time covering up nipples. Body ConQuest came on 2 floppy disks, something that was extremely uncommon for disk system games. Side A of Disk 1 is what you put in to start the game and held your save data. Side B is where all the naked pictures are, and that is the only thing on that side. Disk 2 Side A is all of the overworld data, and Disk 2 Side B is all of the dungeon data. This means you're going to be swapping disks a lot, sometimes mid-conversation to get a picture and then have it flip back. It's not exactly clear when Body ConQuest was released, but I do know it was at least late 1991. The reason for that is the Body ConQuest box is clearly a parody of Dragon Quest IV's box. Actually, I don't know if I would call it a parody so much as a direct copy. But this is Hacker International's episode, so we'll be generous and say it's a parody. The plot of the game is that you're a kid whose dad was a hero, and now there's a kidnapped princess. And of course, there's a dragon lord out there. So you'll wander from town to town, clearing whatever dungeon happens to be nearby, getting slightly better equipment as you go, and eventually defeating the big monster at the end of the game. As you're walking around, if you hit A, it'll bring up a menu, and this menu has 5 options: talk, item, magic, equip, and search. Obviously, talking is how you converse, but it doesn't always work properly. If you're not precisely aligned and directly in their face, then you won't talk to them. And sometimes the characters that are wandering around the town just won't let you approach properly. Items where you go to use the things that you've purchased, mostly healing herbs. You have 6 inventory slots, and these have to be shared with your equipment, so 3 of them are probably going to be permanently taken up. That's assuming you don't find any additional equipment in a dungeon or anything like that. The only ways to get things out of your inventory are to consume them or to sell them. And selling items is rarely convenient. There are a few quest-required items that don't count towards your inventory, like a key that will open certain doors, or a ring that's necessary to pass through certain areas. These are always found on a second page of the inventory. You learn magic spells as you level up in the game, though it's not automatic. You have to sleep at an inn before the magic spell will show up in your list. It also takes quite a while before you get anything. It's level 8 before you get your first spell, which is Heal, and then level 10 gets you a spell that will do some minor damage to enemies on the screen. But just due to sheer cost, the main spells you're going to use are the healing spells, and a spell that you get at level 20 that can warp you to any town. For equipment, you have a weapon, you have a shield, and you have armor. In Body Conquest, there are 4 of each of those in the game, total. And the strongest ones are found in dungeons. In fact, for the armor and the shield, you can easily find them before you find the second one of those. And because of the way the game's story is structured, you'll be using the 100 gold knife that you purchase in the first town for about 3/4 of the game. The search command is solely used to open treasure chests. There's no puzzles or hidden items here. In the starting town, you're initially summoned to meet the king to give you your quest. Talking to the king is how you save your game, and this becomes a major issue in Body Conquest, because this is a game that has a lot of empty space in it. The overworld map is huge, the dungeon maps are huge, and it could take you 10 or 15 minutes of walking to get back to the king to save. And if you get defeated, it's just game over. There's no going back to the king and losing half your gold here. There is an item that lets you teleport between towns. It costs 1,000 gold, and it'll be quite a while before you can spend that freely. You don't get the spell that will let you teleport around until you're level 20, which is about the point when you'd be entering the final dungeon. The king gives you 100 gold, which is just enough to buy a knife, the only thing that the equipment shop sells in this town. You've got to get to the second town before you can buy armor. There's also an item shop that sells healing herbs for 5 gold, a full heal item for 65,000 gold, and that teleporting item. It costs 100 gold to stay at the inn, and this is common across all the towns in the game. When you're starting out, enemies that you defeat will drop about 3 to 5 gold, so you have to use herbs to heal in the early game and avoid the inn. When you step out of town, it's time to start fighting. And the way this works in Body Conquest is enemies appear at the edge of the screen and slowly walk towards the center. If they hit you from the side or back, then you take damage, and if you run into them from the front, then they take damage and get pushed back a little bit. It's basically ease combat, except slightly worse. If enemies hit you from the side or the back, well, your health pretty much vanishes. Even when you have good armor, your health pretty much just vanishes. But generally speaking, unless you're standing at the edge of the screen, it's really easy to avoid that. Exploration is handled in single screen segments. You walk off the edge and it scrolls over to the next one. On the overworld, this is a real issue, because you can't really see when you're playing on a television set where you can walk off. And there's a lot of screens where there's only a tiny sliver at the very edge that's passable. It makes navigating the overworld way harder than it should be. At the start of the game, you're just going to want to grind up levels. And this is definitely one of those games where it helps to identify the opportunities to earn experience in cash. Ideally, you want screens where there's wide open edges, so you're not boxed in, and there's plenty of opportunities for enemies to spawn. And then you just hang out on that single screen forever, running into enemies until you're at the level that you want. Enemy power increases don't occur by region, they occur based on whether you've reached certain spots. So after you've upgraded 3 or 4 times, you walk around until you find the second town, and then by entering it, you've upgraded the enemies in the overworld. The second town is where you can buy a shield and armor, and then it's off to the first dungeon. And this is another point where you're going to want to stop and grind for a while. The money and experience increase in this dungeon, but not the risk. If you're under-leveled, you'll do barely any damage to enemies, and there are certain enemy spawns that tend to outclass others in the dungeons. So you might find enemies that you can easily defeat and give you hardly any experience, right alongside enemies that effectively don't take any damage from you. At the end of this dungeon is the first boss. And just in case you are concerned that Body ConQuest would only have pictures of girls, here's a sexy topless snake man for anyone whose tastes go that way. Generally speaking, in Body ConQuest, the way you handle bosses is by walking back and forth on their head. The boss's health is in the lower right-hand corner, while yours is in the upper left. One thing to be aware of when fighting a boss is that you can't cast spells or heal during it. Once you've entered the room, you are locked into this battle until one of you is dead. With the snake man down, you rescue the princess, and of course you have to identify her by checking out the heart-shaped birthmark on her butt. And you're goddamned right that this video is going to wind up age-restricted. With the princess rescued, you then have to go all the way back to the castle. There are no easy exits from the dungeon either. You have to backtrack the path, which is about 20 screens long to get out of the dungeon, and then about another 20 screens to get to the castle. The king gives you the key that opens a lot of special doors, but not all of them, and then you walk back to the same dungeon, back to the boss room, and can open the door there. That gets you to another part of the continent with the third town. And in the third town, there are no friendly people. All of the townspeople attack you. You can't kill them, they just attack you. Finding this guy in his own little mini dungeon will let you know that they're under the thrall of a monster in another dungeon. And so once you locate that dungeon, you can take a very, very long path to locate the strongest shield in the game, and eventually find the second boss. I think the horse crab bug guy is considerably less sexy than the snake man, but to each their own. Once it's down, then you have another princess show up, which means it's time to check out her birthmark. This frees the people in the third town, and they'll tell you how to get to the fourth town. The fourth town at least is relatively normal, so you can sleep at the inn, buy an upgraded weapon and armor if you really want, though you may not want to purchase that armor. And you also meet this girl, and you get a nice, normal picture of her. See, Body ConQuest isn't all topless women. In fact, let's just talk to her again and oh, I think it's moving a bit fast here. This town actually doesn't have a whole lot in it. It just happens to be near the location of a dungeon that has the best armor in it, and nothing else. Plus, it's at the entrance to the very, very long path to the fifth town. Even if you've been grinding on those overworld enemies, the monsters in this dungeon are likely to outclass you. But you can just run through them all, get the armor, and move on. That'll bring you to the fifth and final town in the game, where everyone is frozen and can't talk. Well, except for this woman, who you'll get a nice picture of. And then when you chat with her again, she'll strip a bit. And then you chat again, and she'll strip a bit more. You can also talk to the princess of this town, who will let you know that the town has been cursed, and you'll have to go to the nearby dungeon, the second to last dungeon in the game, to free the town from the effect. And of course, she'll get naked for you so you can confirm the birthmark. Leaving this town is what triggers the next enemy upgrade for the overworld, and it's another point where you'll want to start grinding. And that's as far as I got in the game, and for as much walking as I did, that was only about an hour and a half of play. I don't usually drill down this far into the details of the game, but let's be realistic here, the only reason anyone would play this is to see those pictures of the girls, and I wanted them in context, what little context actually existed for this. It is a real problem that you have 2 of the 5 towns where when you arrive at them, you can't do anything, because that means you can't purchase the item that will teleport you back to save your game. So if I wanted to recover when I reached that last town, I'd have to walk all the way back to the 4th town, and then do what I needed to do there. That's a trip of about 5 minutes if I wanted to do that. From here on, there was that dungeon, then you get access to the Dragon Lord's dungeon, and then you beat the final boss and win the game. When you're following a guide or have maps, Body ConQuest is extremely short. There's just nothing here. And the progression is so badly balanced, you'll have no trouble identifying where you'll want to stand around and level up. And the environments that you're exploring really aren't very interesting. you'll see the exact same dungeon corridors over and over again. Basically, Body Conquest is a weird historical oddity. No one's going to want to play it because it's a fun game. I don't think anyone wanted to play it for that reason even back when it was new. And of course, these days, the other reason to play it, the reason most people would give it a look, is completely negated by the existence of the internet. The only reason to check this one out is because of the novelty of the subject matter. But even there, the reason I played for an hour and a half is because when I hit the 45-minute mark, I had only gotten one picture. At that point, I decided I needed to push through as far as I could to show as many pictures as possible in this video. And I actually think all of the pictures are in the video. At least there's no additional reward shot at the end of the game, so you've seen literally everything this one has to offer. Basically, they withhold those pictures from you for as long as possible, and then they don't exactly have a whole lot of pictures. It really seems like Body Conquest is a game that would disappoint even the horniest of teenage boys.